A carpenter from the country, an untrained preacher, a man who people claimed healed them from disease or injury, then a political dissident, a criminal. This was who Jesus was in the eyes of his society. To the important people of his time, he was unimportant, if not dangerous. Jesus wore many marks of societal shame. He was so much a shame to society that he was hung on a tree, one of the cruelest forms of punishment for a criminal in the Roman Empire. It is risky to live a life pointed toward the good. It is risky to draw the circle wider than those in religious and political power say you should. It is risky. So risky, in fact, that you might lose your life. Jesus wasn't the Messiah that the Jews were looking for. They were expecting someone with power, someone that could change the political order and liberate the Jews from their oppression. The way that Jesus died only confirmed for many that this was not their Messiah. Their Messiah wouldn't die such a shameful death. But God has a way of working when we think all is lost, of making a way out of no way. Our passage today is one of my favorites. Jesus appears to the disciples after his death and resurrection. They know the risk of living a life pointed toward the good. So much so that they have locked their doors. They're hiding out. They're scared. They fear they have already risked too much just being seen with this Jesus when he was alive. They fear the same death that Jesus suffered will be theirs. And Jesus appears to them despite the locked doors. And the way he appears is what's so important. He is still wearing the marks of his societal shame. He is quite literally bearing the marks of what society believes he is, a criminal who deserved to die a public and painful death on a tree. The wounds in Jesus' feet and hands and side have not disappeared in the miracle of the resurrection. He bears them for those he loves, his followers and confidants, to witness. He seems to bear them somewhat proudly, or at least not ashamedly, because he knows this is how his people will know him. Thomas quite literally says, "Unless I see the marks, I will not believe that this is our Jesus." And when Thomas does see the wounds, his response is, "My Lord and my God." He recognizes Jesus as his rabbi and his Messiah. Somehow our wounds make us known to those who are closest to us. The marks of societal shame don't define us in any way. They aren't intrinsic to who we are, but instead create relationships where we can know each other better, where we recognize the person in front of us, where we recognize the risk and the love and the power. The shame that society puts on us is not the end of the story. Recently, Chris and I had the opportunity to see The Color Purple, the musical, at the Peace Center. I know many of you saw it also. Did you hear the theology of that show? Because boy, was it loaded. Alice Walker, the writer of the book, The Color Purple, actually has a whole body of theology founded after her. She was a theologian in her own right. Womanist is the name of this school of theology. It was founded because there was nowhere else for Black American women to be heard in the theological discussions of the day. Womanist thinkers tell us that Black women in particular experience what could be described as triple jeopardy, devalued and dehumanized on account of racism, sexism, and classism. And we see this in the life of Celie in The Color Purple. She's the main character. Through the beginning of the book and the story, Celie is subject to every other person she comes in contact with. She's subject to her stepfather, her husband, to the white women in the town, even the children of her new husband. She's held prisoner by her lack of education and opportunities. But for Celie, God makes a way out of no way. Through her relationship with another Black woman, Shug Avery, and reminders of the love of her sister when she was a child, Celie rediscovers the love that God has always had for her. I want to jump and shout every time in the movie when Celie leaves her abusive husband with these words: "I'm poor, Black, I might even be ugly, but by God, I'm here. I'm here." Celie names the things that society tells her that she should be ashamed of, but she has limited their power by saying, "And here I am, just the way God made me." It's a risky move for Celie to go out on her own economically, to risk the revenge of her husband, but she does it. She takes the way that God has made for her, the way that points toward the good. Celie bears the wounds and shame of a society simply because she is poor and Black and a woman. But that's not the end of the story. God makes a way out of no way. In African American Christianity, this phrase and idea that God makes a way out of no way runs strong and deep. It says that although the world may shame us, we know that God doesn't. We know that God is still working towards salvation for each of us, even when the world has given up on that idea. But still, shame is something we all have to deal with. It speaks to each of us at our core. Brené Brown is a writer and researcher who has spent much of her career studying shame in American culture. She defines shame in this way: shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. She goes on to say that shame is an epidemic in this country, that we feel shame related to many, many things. Shame at being a mother who can't do it all. Shame at being a father who doesn't spend enough time with his children or doesn't make enough money. Shame at being an adult child who still isn't loved and accepted by our parent. Shame for who we love. Shame for what we haven't achieved. Shame that we are Black, or shame that we are poor and white. Shame that we aren't educated. Shame tells us we aren't good enough. But Brené Brown also talks about the ways to combat shame. She says that shame only survives through secrecy and silence. If you break those things, you break the power of shame. In a sermon that I preached last year on Psalm 139, I told you all about our first miscarriage. Since then, we've had another. I can't quite explain why I feel the need to say this from the pulpit, but I think it has something to do with shame and with combating shame. With both miscarriages, I questioned what I did wrong, what I did to cause it, what was wrong with me. In fact, this was my first reaction. But it was through talking openly about my experiences that the shame began to disappear. It was through conversations with many of you, hearing your similar experiences, hearing your expressions of empathy. I knew I had to share my feeling of shame or it would eat me alive. But here's the rest of the story. And I have to tell Jim that I actually do know who Paul Harvey is, and I'm only 32 years old. I found that it was the experience of sharing something that society told me I shouldn't, that was where God worked. There's something about sharing our shame in the open with the right people that help us to know each other better, and even, I think, to know God better. Secrecy and silence would not be the ruler of the day. The empathy I received in response to my shame reminded me of the God who loves us no matter what. In womanist theology, it's not just God working. God makes a way, and we choose to walk it. This was my version of walking the way that God had created. God created a way forward that I didn't know would exist, and then I decided to take the path. It was something about bearing the wounds that society had literally put on the body of Christ, bearing those wounds in the open, unashamedly, that changed everything, that opened up a way for us all, that made a way out of no way. Because this is precisely what God did in the life of Jesus. God took all the shame that culture could pile onto a person in the form of Jesus and made sure that that was not the end of the story. Jesus showed the wounds on his hands and feet and side, a sign that the society was so ashamed of him, a sign that he should be killed. And Jesus said, I may be poor, I may be a Galilean and a Jew, I might even be dead, but by God, I'm here. The power of God overcame the power of shame that day. We know that society's shames on us are just a piece and not the whole. That a new way comes, a way that we can't even know yet. But God knows. We can know that God makes a way out of no way. When the world seems closed toward the good, God is always working toward freedom. We just have to walk the way that God has made.